So to introduce myself, I'm Louise Younie. I'm a GP and Professor of Medical Education at Queen Mary University of London. I'm GP in Bristol, so I'm in Bristol at the minute. And I guess for the last 20 years, I've been exploring the human dimension of clinical practice and how we access that. And I've been engaging the arts in that. So I'll tell you a bit more as we go along, but is it okay if we make it interactive? So we actually start with a bit of interaction. We have interaction all the way through. Is that all right? Does that work?
That would be lovely. I was about to put in the chat, but I'll say it now that we ask people to keep their cameras on as so we're actually here together as part of a community rather than a lot of initials. So please do have your cameras on and let's make it as interactive as we can online.
Thank you. And interestingly, we've been talking about this with students and sort of exploring that. Actually, it makes a difference, I suppose, to how you speak and share, because a lot of the stuff is depending on, but I know people have to have it off for some of it sometimes as well. So let's have a look. Here we go. So these are the areas that we thought we'd think about. And so resilience and flourishing as a verb, and how we might create flourishing spaces. I'm just going to read you a tiny bit of a poem that a doctor wrote after I did a creative inquiry session around taking care of ourselves. Take care of yourself, doctor. Words spoken in a moment of door handle hesitation. The door closes behind you, your comment suspended in the silence. A platitude, perhaps, or kind words well meant. And the narrative goes on, and in the end, she stops and thinks after the patient's gone. She thinks about the heaviness and the weight and the challenge, and how can she go on caring and caring and caring? But in the end, she kind of says to the air, "Thank you, I will." And I like to introduce this idea of taking care of ourselves because it helps just put us in a different space. And I'm just going to share a menti, and I'd love it if you could finish off the sentence. And I'm hopeful that I'll have time to construct it into some kind of poem to share at the end, but let's see. So I'm going to share this menti. So at work, I feel cared for when, and if people can just put in anything. I've done these poems a lot of times, and it's so interesting, the things that, like cups of tea and things like that make us feel cared for. So anything that makes you feel cared for. Hopefully that QR code is working okay. Yeah. That's brilliant. I'm going to stop sharing so there'll be a nice surprise when we do the poem at the end. But hopefully everyone's got the QR code now, and feel free to pop your thoughts in there. I'll go back to them. So we'll come back to that as a finale. Just to give a little bit of background, I went into medicine wanting to be kind, but also sort of thinking that it was black and white. And my training made me believe that it was all about diagnoses and treatment. And when I became a GP and started listening to my patients, I kind of realized that there was so much more, and there was so much grey in it. So having gone from wanting to be an orthopedic surgeon, which I thought would be black and white, but it wasn't. I did 6 months, and then kind of coming into general practice and really learning from my patients. I became an academic at the same time, and just thought, how can I help my future students? How do I communicate across from me to my patients? They need and want things from me that I don't know how to give, beyond a diagnosis and treatment. And how can I help future students following in my footsteps? Because it was kind of like a real it's kind of a shock, really, to realize that my diagnosis and treatments weren't enough. And so I've been on a journey ever since, and predominantly, but not only, using the arts as a way of connecting us with our humanity very rapidly and very instantly. And I haven't yet found any other way over my 20 years of a better way of engaging a group of professionals with more of the human dimension of what's going on. And so I've written and thought quite a lot about the human dimension, and so I know this isn't directly relevant to everybody, but I think in every profession there is a human dimension. So whether it's medical or any other, if it's teaching, if it's, I don't know, being a lawyer or a vicar or whatever, and there's a human dimension. And often, and maybe it's Donald Schoen's professional artistry, but it's the other side. We get taught the clinical dimension. We think we're an expert in our field, and we go up the spiral. This is a double-stranded DNA of a clinical consultation or of medical education. But for the human dimension, which is around being present with suffering, being with grief, trying to understand the person that's in front, trying to work out how to be person-centered, I think that's going down the spiral, and it involves curiosity and humility, realizing epistemic humility, even sort of realizing all the things that we've taught and learned don't necessarily prepare us for meeting this person as the expert of their lived experience. So students might be the experts of their lived experience, patients are the expert of their lived experience. And so to engage with the human dimension and the lived experience, we need to go down the spiral. And as I was working with the students in lots of creative ways, and I also engaged, so I run a sort of student selected component where they can choose invited patient artists, arts therapists, music therapists, arts for health consultants of different. And so I've learned alongside over the 20 years I've been running this course, lots of different people that have come in. And as we humanize the patients, I was aiming for person-centered care and how can I help for that? I realized we humanize the students, and I started thinking beyond resilience and the issues with resilience and thinking about flourishing. And it feels like resilience is kind of mainly what we've been hearing for the answer for everything over the last, and through COVID and everything. We all just need to be more resilient, push harder, try harder, work harder. So well-being is, this as a physician, well-being is a wicked problem. It is actually, it's really difficult to solve in the world that we're living in today. And I really appreciated this article just calling it out, because actually realizing that it's a difficult problem. And here it's saying it's, increasing burden of complexity and clerical burden and, all the time and the pressure. But I think it applies again across many different spaces and places. And resilience has been sort of the answer to all of our struggling. But now actually, I've been calling it out for a little while, but actually in the literature, it is starting to change, and people are talking about the risk of resilience shaming. When you don't feel like you're strong enough, if only I was a bit stronger, or that it's only part of the solution. So we do need to be strong for the bits that we can't change. So for a clinician, it might be to be alongside suffering, patient suffering, but we don't need to be strong in the face of a toxic system that is not treating us as human beings. And the little box down here, once I was over at someone else's medical school teaching on flourishing, and in the morning, the students had this brief resilience scale. And in my mind, it doesn't take any account, let's say, of trauma, say of childhood trauma, say of childhood cancer. I know myself, I went through cancer, and I would have scored very badly on this brief resilience scale. But I would say that just getting dressed and going to see the doctor was the strongest thing like I'll ever do. It's much harder than anything I do now. And so a scale like this doesn't take any account of the tough ground that we're on right now. And I feel like it can point us in the wrong direction and make people who feel weak or score badly feel worse. And actually, they may be the strongest person in the room. And I'm not going to show this, but the slides will be shared afterwards. It's a really funny, it's like a 2-minute video about a doctor critiquing resilience and how the hospital or whatever, the managers are telling them to be more resilient. It's Glauc Cornfleck, and he's a clinician who's a comedian. So I'll let you look at that afterwards. But as I've been talking more and more about flourishing, and I've been exploring flourishing now for about with the students and with other clinicians, and wherever I go, I'm sort of learning from people. The more I talk about it, the more I realize I can't get away from neoliberalism, which is something that wasn't really in my vocabulary when I started, probably. But it's the air that we breathe, and that's water that we swim in, and it's the movement from valuing people to us just being part of that product and performance metrics and profitability, turning us into kind of consumers and believing that market forces are the only way to do things. It's a lot about reducing funding for the public sector and making everything competition. And I feel like some of this flourishing work, it is difficult to flourish when we are an automaton in a system like this. But I believe that if we recognize what we're up against, and any little thing that we do to develop our human relationships and connections is moving in the direction of flourishing. So I don't feel without hope. So we're going to move into what flourishing might be and go to the next slide here. So in one word, what does flourishing mean to you? There's a question. I can't hear you though.
We've got somebody wanting to ask a question.
Yeah,
but
that's
I
fine.
don't know if you. Yep, that's great. Do you want while people are completing the Menti?
That's fine.
Yeah. And I can't see the name of the person who've got their hand up. Let me see if I can.
I think I can. Well, it says okay, but I can't hear you when you talk.
We can't hear you. Okay. Do you want to put your question in the chat or your comment in the chat, and I can read it out? Are you struggling with the Mentimeter?
If you can't use a QR code, you can just go to menti.com and use this number 41884211. These are beautiful. I so enjoy these Mentimeters, and again, I do them in different places and spaces, and often growth comes up biggest in the middle. So when anyone uses the same word twice, but we're obviously all very independent of thought, but we do have growing growth. Oh, there we go. Growing growth, growing to full potential. But also I really enjoy the ones around the edges as well, of the different kinds, like a fish in water. I've never had that one before. Meaningful. Expanding beautifully. Freedom is a beautiful one. So I'll add these to the slides afterwards so you can see your words as well. So you'll have access to this. Okay. So one thing is around just policy, just to mention, I've been lucky in that Queen Mary University London I didn't know this at the time I started exploring flourishing, but they have as their highest mission statement that the students and staff would flourish. What that actually means is not necessarily clear, and how do we enable that in the times and spaces that we're in? But it has helped with leverage in terms of making space to have time to explore this and gain funding to explore it further. So some thoughts on flourishing. The students in my groups help me so much, and I feed them ideas and they feed me them back. And this is one from one of my students. She's now a fourth year medical student, but I met her first when she was a first year Elle. And she talked about flourishing compared to resilience being a kinder way to grow. I just think that's such a lovely concept. And flourishing, really, it's an old concept as well as a new one. So originally Aristotle's eudaimonia was translated as happiness, but now latterly it's been translated as flourishing. And he talks about meaning and purpose alongside his hedonia, which is being happy through sort of, chocolate to give you a quick fix. This is sort of, I don't know, joy or well-being through engaging in meaningful, purposeful pursuits. It's also new in that there's a sort of suddenly a massive interest in it, actually, and lots of funding. So the Templeton World Charity Foundation has run 2 global flourishing conferences. They say the first in the world, and I haven't seen anything for. I don't know if they did it last year. And they've invested, I don't know, I think they say 100 million now into people exploring flourishing. The Kern National Network is a group of medical schools looking at flourishing and character. And Harvard have this huge and well-funded program, Human Flourishing Program, where they are trying to measure flourishing. And you can do a quiz to find out, here we go, are you flourishing? Take the quiz. You can find out if you're flourishing 5 out of 10 or 7 out of 10. Personally, I don't find that helpful, and as Sarah Willem points out, so I've got Willem versus Vanderweel there, verb or noun, that they're thinking of it more as a noun and as a thing that you can just measure without taking any account or critiquing the social structures that we live within. And so Willem talks more about flourishing as a verb, and in her research in rethinking flourishing in the US Midwest, she found that people were less likely to describe themselves as flourishing when they were in certain financial brackets and certain racial groups. And so she's interested in what are the barriers to flourishing rather than what do I score out of 10. And the same, I'm interested with the students that I work with and the clinicians that I work with, how do we enable movement in the flourishing direction? What does that look like? Rather than, are you flourishing 8 out of 10 right now? And in fact, Sarah Willen, we've done some work together. She's a critical anthropologist. She's just sent me her latest paper, and I haven't finished reading it yet. Who gets to define flourishing? Again, critiquing the Harvard work, and beautifully written, the bit that I've read so far. But it's very near the top of my list. So I've tried to define flourishing. And in fact, I shared it with Sarah Willen's anthropology students and some of my medical students. And I discovered from her paper that this could be connection or relationship, that nearly all the flourishing models have meaning making and relationship in them. But shadow work is one that I haven't seen in any of the other models. And in fact, I think it's probably the most important part of flourishing as I see and understand it through the creative inquiry and with the work with the students. Compassion for self and other is fairly obvious. And that it's an ecological concept. So rather than resilience, which means in Latin to spring back or rebound, flourishing is from the Latin to blossom, bloom, grow. And it allows us to think in our inner life rather than, I often say, resilience in material science is how much you can take until a material snaps. And I just feel like that's a bad metaphor for our inner life. And so with flourishing, we can actually think about a tree. I've got a birch tree I planted. It's quite big now down the bottom of my garden 20 years ago, and it has different seasons, and it was planted near a compost bin. And, so what nurturing are you getting? What is the weather system coming through? If you feel like you're in winter, like my tree looks now, it's bare, but, spring might be around the corner. It gives us a little bit more flex for our inner life than this idea of bouncing back to where we were before. And I know for sure through my own cancer experience, I did not bounce back or rebound to the same shape. I have had to grow around it. So these are some of the fundamental building blocks with which I think about flourishing with the students. And the shadow work. So some of the examples, and I think the power of it is something around rehumanizing ourselves. Often we end up in our own bubbles feeling alone with our imposter syndrome. And here you see, this is a student image with a face on the floor, or this idea of perfectionism. And this student talked about having to draw the face again and again and again, even though she's trying not to be perfectionist, but to make it good enough. Angela, I see you've got your hand up.
Hi, sorry, I've got my camera off still. My eyes are doing funny things right now. But I wondered if you could say a bit more about shadow work, because I think the term might not be that familiar to everyone in the room. But thank you.
Okay. Yeah, thank you. Yeah. So I've got a few more images that I'll talk about. But yeah, sorry, so I've drawn the concept from the Jungian idea of shadow work, and it's I sort of simplify it, or I think about it as engaging with the things that we don't like in ourselves and the things that we don't like going on in our lives. And often it's the things that we want to avoid and we feel uncomfortable with. But when one student starts creates an image or writes a bit of poetry, and it takes in some of the imposter syndrome, and then the other students hear it, suddenly they feel not alone. And I call it the well-being of what is. We have people in a room, and often the students are told for their well-being to eat well, sleep well, don't drink, do this, don't do that, the well-being of doing something more. But actually the well-being of what is like when we create spaces where people can bring themselves and they realize they're not alone, and they actually rehumanize. They realize we're all a bit broken. We all have weaknesses and challenges and struggles, and that's deeply humanizing and connecting. And so that for me is the shadow work. And it's almost like, the highs and the joys we can do, but it's almost like how we deal with the struggles and the challenge is probably more important to our flourishing, perhaps. And so for me, flourishing isn't just sort of being happy. It's more about connecting and bringing who I am, or who we are, or connecting together in a situation where we feel part of the human race. So here's another student, big smile coming out of the emergency department, but actually what they're thinking is, I don't know enough, I feel lost, am I getting in everyone's way? Will I finish my logbook on time? And so often we don't recognize the sort of thoughts going on in people's heads, and we'll have our own ones and then think it's only us that are going around with that. Or this one here is there's one of the students painted this little black fish and said, I feel like this little black fish, and all the other medical students are these sort of brightly colored fish all swimming around. And again, that's, I guess, that sense of imposter syndrome. But by sharing that, other people wrote in their journal that they were so relieved to hear that. They hadn't dared share it in the group, but they felt really, that she was brave enough to actually share it. So this takes a huge amount of courage to do the shadow work, both to face our own kind of stuff, but also to bring it out in spaces with other people. And this is what one of the students said around these spaces. I call this a flourishing space, really. So I didn't expect to hear that other students felt out of their depth, or like other people were more talented and bright than them. So it's nice to discover I'm not the only one. I didn't expect how open and honest everyone would be, and it was refreshing. And a final picture, this is a cushion that a student did for an assignment. And if you draw a line down the middle, you'll see that one side is crying and the other side is peacefully sleeping. And you might see the patient surfing or drowning in the hair. And it's the health professional at night kind of worrying about the people they haven't helped, and feeling a sense of peace where they feel like they have at least, done some good work. And Elle, again, one of my students, so moving from resilience towards flourishing, I don't have to bounce back from every hard experience like I had permanent springs under my shoes. They're not permanent and they get rusty easily. The journey towards flourishing allows me to take painful experiences with me, explore them through creative inquiry, and accept them as part of me rather than as flaws I would like to exclude from my life. And finally, I love engaging with the student voice because they bring, but this is a poem. I was doing acrostic poems with the same group. I sort of share my ideas on flourishing, and two of the guys went off together and each wrote an acrostic poem. So you have resilience down one side and flourish down the other. And not everyone will agree with it, and people critique that maybe it's overly negative on resilience. But anyway, here we go. Really push yourself to the limits. Excel in everything you do. Stop letting hardships affect you. Invest in yourself. Leave nothing to chance. It's no big deal. Expect greatness no matter the circumstances. Everything, always. And flourish. Finding yourself, living with mistakes, opening yourself to new experiences, understanding it's okay to change, realizing growth is not linear, inviting forgiveness, staying true, holding space. And it feels like they perhaps capture what I'm trying to get across in that short poem better than all the other bits, but so I appreciate. There isn't that much work. This is just as an aside because it may not feel so relevant, but just to sort of say where flourishing is at in different fields. So within medical education, it still isn't very much in the literature. I've found these kind of different articles, one that's actually exploring trauma-informed care and flourishing, which I'm also trying to do or interested in and want to develop and think more about how these two go together. But also these guys have done, the Flickinger guys have done a website around flourishing and put together some different exercises that you could do with a student. And this is an old paper thinking about flourishing in medical education. So what about flourishing spaces? So we've moved, so in some ways, so we critiqued resilience and started thinking about flourishing, but then we actually started thinking, actually, is it about an individual flourishing, or is it more about how do we, thinking about the Sarah Willen paper in the Midwest US, the US Midwest, is it about the spaces for people to flourish? And if we're thinking we're in an organization, or we're in a medical school, or we're in a hospital, or we're with a patient, actually, might we be able to create a flourishing space where more of the people can flourish more? And so it's not so much the attention on the individual, but how the space around us. So, for example, Queen Mary University of London wants to be the most inclusive university in the world, they say, or wants to, it really welcomes widening participation students. But do we then create a flourishing space for people as they come in, or how do we do that? And so this is one model that that I've kind of come up with. Because not many people are talking about flourishing spaces, and I was trying to think of ways to conceptualize it. And it's, probably an evolution. But to use the ASK acronym, and to remember to ask for help if things are not helping, but so that we create a space for attending to self and other. And that draws a little bit on Simone Weil's work on attention being the rarest and purest form of generosity. So attending, and it's something about the students being seen and being heard, and particularly the creative inquiry. So when students create different things and share it and are heard by their colleagues, it can feel a bit scary, and they talk about feeling vulnerable, but also they feel profoundly heard and seen in new ways. They often talk about feeling, when I'm in the middle of a research study on the creative inquiry and flourishing, and they often talk about feeling like a number in the curriculum, but actually this sort of thing just humanizes. And then the S is about sharing stories and shadow work, as I've described. So in the sharing stories and storytelling being such a powerful thing, often like it's more moving from a 2D to a 3D world, where we actually draw on our cultures and our understandings in the stories that we share. They're sort of framed in the metaphors, and so that they sort of can profoundly say, be a way of connecting and meaning making with others. And finally, kindling hope, particularly. So a flourishing space might be one where we can kindle hope in the face of being in a neoliberal system. And let's not be unrealistic about it. The work that I did 20 years ago with my nice little box of notes, and where I had time to talk to patients, is so utterly transformed into what it is today. And that it's very hard to do anything other than be transactional in the shapes and spaces that we get. But we need to kindle hope for that human dimension. And so let me just see. So I have got a couple more slides, and then maybe an exercise. I don't know if I'll just put it out there so people can think about it with a postcard exercise, and then time for questions. Just to say that two things we're exploring: flourishing through creative inquiry, but also flourishing through co-creation. And I know that's sort of deep within your fibers as well, but co-creating across educators and students can be really powerful. And I particularly, it's maybe not surprising that the students flourish, but I love this educator quote, again, for the human dimension. The co-creation allowed me to flourish and grow, in that it allowed me to reconnect to learners and students in a way that I didn't realize I was missing, but that I was missing. And the same might be said of with our patients, that there might be spaces and ways that we can reconnect with our patients or the people we work with in ways that we didn't realize we were missing. I think I might have said it enough. Just that finding our voice, valuing humanity, and realizing that we're all a bit broken, and vulnerability being part of the journey, I think, are all part of flourishing. And there's lots of other models. I mean, so it overlaps with self-determination theory. We've been doing some work around belonging, dignity, and justice and flourishing, rather than EDI, using these words from Decolonized Design, a Black-led organization. We can say, but I can't go into. And then we sometimes do a postcard exercise, but I don't know where everyone's at in terms of would people be happy to go into groups and do that? Because then I can set it up. Shall I just stop sharing a second to take the temperature of the room? It's all very well talking about it, but actually the most fun bit is when you just start engaging. And it's a very gentle way to engage in creative inquiry. I'd get us all to look at this postcard first, and then I've got an online website where you can choose a postcard and share it in groups of 2s and 3s, just that resonates with your lived experience. So you talk a little bit about yourself through the postcard. I see someone's got their hand up. Natasha.
Thanks, Louise. Sorry, could you just go back to the theory that you referenced on the previous slide?
Which one was it? Here? Oh, wait, can you, where are we?
Nothing's
Am
coming
I-
up at the moment.
Oh yeah, sorry, I wasn't sharing screen. I'm looking at the slide, or not showing screen. Was it here?
Self-determination theory. That's fantastic. Thank you.
Yeah, so just to say, there's a really fantastic. So I started talking about flourishing and self-determination theory myself, and then I just Googled it. I thought, hey, I wonder if anyone else has thought about that. And it turns out that the people that designed self-determination theory, so Ryan and Desi, actually have done a book chapter with a moral philosopher on flourishing, and it's got a lot of research and thought about how they overlap in ethos and value system. So it's a very deep well of interesting stuff to explore. Does that answer your question? Yep.
Yes, thank you.